Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I am joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
All right. My team is not in the World Series, and I find it strangely much more calming to watch the World Series when my team is not in it. So I'm kind of enjoying that.
Yeah, I get that. The only time I can really watch football and enjoy it is when the Seahawks are not playing, because otherwise I'm just so tense about every little thing.
Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about then.
Okay, so I asked you to tell me about the Electoral College because, of course, it's a very big deal this time of year. Everyone is talking about, Trump or Biden's route to 270 electoral votes. So I was hoping that you could fill me in on how we got here and whether it's ever going to change.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And thanks again for a good question and a very timely question. Each of the two questions you asked, namely whether the Electoral College was a good idea when it was first instituted, and is there any good reason to keep it around today, each of those two questions could have made a wonderful podcast. So the trickiest part for me was kind of weaving those two questions together into one coherent answer. So I hope I'm up to the task. First, I'm going to tell you how the system works today. Then I'll consider each of your questions in turn. I want to start my explanation with what, for many of us, is the scene of the crime. And I'm going to put a special voice on for this next sentence. November 8th, 2016. A date that will live in infamy.
Okay.
How'd you like my FDR voice? Good?
You got my attention. Yeah, I am rapt.
Yeah, okay. Of course, that date, November 8th, 2016, was the date that Donald J. Trump won the presidency by capturing a whopping 46.4% plurality of the popular vote against Hillary Clinton, who won 48.5% and received nearly 2.9 million more votes than Trump. How did Trump win without beating Clinton at the polls? Because he won the only vote that really mattered, the one in the Electoral College, where he finished with 306 electoral votes to Clinton's 232. You see, this is because we don't actually vote for our preferred candidate. We vote for a slate of electors who pledge to vote for our candidate. Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution established the Electoral College. The Constitution says nothing about who can be an elector, but it does stipulate that sitting representatives, senators, or other federal office holders can't be electors. Nowadays, each party's slate of electors is appointed by state party chairmen from among well-connected insiders loyal to their party's candidate. Each state has the same number of electors as its members of Congress, that's the House plus the Senate. So, for example, the largest state, California, currently has 55 electoral votes. The 7 smallest states, and that would be Alabama, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming, have only 3 electoral votes, and that's for their 2 senators plus 1 congressional district. There are 538 total electors in the Electoral College, comprised of the 435 representatives, plus the 100 senators, plus Washington, D.C.'s 3 electoral votes, equals 538. So in 48 of our 50 states, the presidential election is a winner-take-all affair in which the winner of the state's popular vote gets the state's entire number of electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska are the 2 outliers. They award 2 electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, but they also award electors to the winners of their congressional districts. So in just those 2 states, it's possible for electors to be assigned to more than one candidate. You with me so far?
I am, though I do have one question. You said that electors are chosen by the state party apparatus. So does that mean that every state has Democratic electors and Republican electors, and only that party's electors are used, depending on how the election goes?
That's right. In fact, on some state ballots, you will actually see the electors listed in fine print underneath your presidential candidate. So you should look at that if you haven't voted yet. So this grand total of 538 electors will remain fixed unless and until more states are added to the Union. Population changes every year as some states get more populous while others lose population. So you might ask, why is the Electoral College number fixed at 538? We can blame the Permanent Reapportion Act of 1929 for that detail. That's the act that capped the number of House members at the level established after the 1910 census, which was 435. Before that, as a state's population grew, it would get more and more representatives in Congress and thus more electoral votes. But after 1929, it was capped. Because of the Permanent Reapportion Act, each state's number of electors doesn't accurately reflect its population relative to that of other states. And this leads to one of the many inequities that critics of the Electoral College would like to remedy. To take the most extreme example, California, which I've already said is our largest state, has over 37 million people according to the 2010 census. It's actually probably over 40 million by now, and 55 electors. Whereas Wyoming, the least populated state in the Union, has fewer than 600,000 people and 3 electors. So California has 66 times the population of Wyoming, but it has just 18 times the number of electors. Put another way, each Wyoming elector represents about 188,000 people, but each California elector represents more than 677,000 people. The Electoral College has changed over the years. 2 of the biggest changes came via constitutional amendments. In 1804, the 12th Amendment modified the original text of Article 2, Section 1 to clarify how electors go about their work and what would happen if no candidate got a majority of electoral votes. And then in 1961, the 23rd Amendment added Washington, D.C. as an electoral district and set forth how many electoral votes it would get. In order to be elected president, the winner of the Electoral College must get half of 538 plus 1. So that's 269 plus 1 equals 270 electoral votes. In an election year, on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December, and don't ask me why that's the date, each state's electors descend on Washington, D.C. to cast their electoral votes. This year, that date is Monday, December 14th. That's when the real presidential election takes place. The end of the formal process is a joint session of the newly sworn-in Congress on January 6, 2021, where the electoral votes are counted and the winner is officially declared by the sitting vice president. In the event that nobody reaches the magic number of 270 electoral votes, the 12th Amendment stipulates that the House of Representatives elects the president from the 3 candidates who receive the most electoral votes, with each state delegation getting 1 vote. The reason I accented the word 3 in that last sentence is because I want to harken back to our last episode about Kanye West's presidential chances, and I just want to point out that this process provides Kanye West with a very narrow window to become our next president. If neither Trump nor Biden gets 270 electoral votes and Kanye can somehow win 1 state and finish 3rd in electoral votes, the House delegations would then be forced to deliberate on whether to make Yeezus our president and Kim Kardashian the first lady. How about that?
Yeah, what an opportunity. I can only imagine that sitting senators and congressmen, I think the average age there is something like 62, 63. They cannot wait to put Kanye in a position of power. I think that's what they've been building towards.
Yes. Okay, so that was the groundwork. Now I want to get to your questions. Why does the Electoral College exist? There's no way to answer this question without giving you and our listeners a brief history lesson. How to elect the president was one of many difficult issues debated by our founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. delegates from large states like James Madison of Virginia favored direct democracy via a popular vote by all eligible voters, which, let's remember at that time, basically consisted of white male landowners.
Yeah.
Madison and his allies argued that Congress should have no role in selecting the president since that would lead to corruption between the executive and legislative branches. On the other side, delegates from smaller states were adamantly opposed to the idea of the people electing their president by popular vote. That position sounds crazy to us today, but remember that in 1787, no other country in the world directly elected its leader. Those opposed to a popular vote thought prospective voters in rural areas, many of which lacked roads, didn't have access to the information necessary to be fully informed about candidates. They also feared, quote-unquote, tyranny of the majority, in which a popular president answerable to a democratic mob of his supporters drowned out minority voices.
Yeah, I remember reading about the tyranny of the majority in, I think, the Federalist Papers when I was reading this in college. They were worrying about that a lot. I think it's a little ironic historically that what we've been talking about most recently in this country is a kind of tyranny of the minority, where a ironclad, Republican-leaning electoral advantage can lead to, for instance, filling out the Supreme Court and whatnot, so that a well-mobilized minority of voters can actually hold the majority at bay.
Yes, and you've now put your finger on one of the major arguments against the Electoral College. So out of all this tumult of the Constitutional Convention came an elaborate compromise allowing the popular election of a president, but on a state-by-state basis instead of nationally, via intermediaries picked by neither Congress nor the people. Each state would appoint independent electors to cast the actual ballots for the presidency. Alexander Hamilton wrote that if the Electoral College is, quote, not perfect, it is at least excellent because it ensured that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Sounds great, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that Lin-Manuel Miranda didn't put that into his musical treatment of the life of Hamilton. I would say we can agree that that's not the Hamilton quote that has aged the best.
Yes, for sure. Most scholars today, of course, disagree with Hamilton and think they argue that the founders understood that the Electoral College wasn't an elegant solution. According to George Edwards, emeritus professor of political science at Texas A&M, I'm quoting, "They were tired, impatient, and frustrated. They cobbled together this plan because they couldn't agree on anything else."
Yeah. And maybe you're going to get to this later, but I feel like the same rationale was offered for other things at the same constitutional convention, like the notorious 3/5 compromise, where a slave counted as 3/5 of a human being when it came to representation, even though those were not voting humans.
Yep, you are right on point.
Yeah, the southern states like Virginia just held out to the point where the northern states, out of exhaustion, were willing to concede to basically undemocratic ideas just to get the whole thing over with.
Yes. So there were two big arguments going on as it applied to voting for president in the Electoral College. And I just told you the first one, which was whether the people should elect the president directly and this compromise of the Electoral College. But then they had a second problem to solve, which was how many electors to assign to each state. And whereas the first argument boiled down to big states versus small states, this second argument about how many electors became an argument between slave-owning states and non-slave-owning states. Should slaves count as part of a state's population? This was no trivial matter because approximately 40% of the residents of southern states were slaves who couldn't vote. In Virginia, which was the largest state at that time, 60% of the population was comprised of slaves. And this, as you just mentioned, is how the infamous 3/5 compromise came about. Slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of allocating electors. As odious as this compromise sounds to our modern sensibilities, it was absolutely essential for securing Southern votes to ratify the Constitution.
Yeah.
And incidentally, it also gave Virginia, with over 200,000 slaves, more than a quarter of the electoral votes required to win the presidency at that time. So is it any wonder that a slave-owning Virginian was elected president for 32 of the USA's first 36 years?
Yeah, Virginia was definitely waving the flag at the front of the parade early in this nation's history. And I think it's fair to say that if, say, you were a New York representative at this constitutional convention, this was a reasonable conclusion to reach. Like, it's easy to think, oh, those racist bastards, how short-sighted of them. But if the states had not banded together and had gone off as individual principalities, it probably would only have been a matter of time before Britain or France or Spain would have shown up and started exerting, imperial ideas again. They needed to stick together in order to hold off the buzzards that would have happily picked them apart. And they probably sold it to themselves as, okay, we'll agree to this now and we'll figure it out later. Eventually, the Civil War figured out the whole, a slave counts as 3/5 of a human being problem. Unfortunately, we're kind of still stuck with the Electoral College now, more than 200 years later.
Yeah, so I agree that the founders had bigger fish to fry and needed to form this nation to keep out the hordes of French and Spanish infidels, for sure. But how interesting that the Electoral College basically boils down to a workaround for slavery.
Yeah. And well, so much of this country's history has boiled down to a workaround for slavery, or Jim Crow after the fact.
Yeah, that's true. So that's how we got the Electoral College, to your first question. But before we leave the 18th century, I want to point out how almost none of the Founding Fathers' assumptions about the Electoral College have been borne out. The founders assumed each elector would be an independent agent, free to vote his conscience. That sure didn't happen. Though the Constitution says nothing about how each state should allot its electoral votes, in the intervening 200-plus years, 48 out of 50 states passed laws to give all their electoral votes to the winner of the state's popular vote, thus wiping out any semblance of elector independence. In addition, there were no political parties in 1787, and the founders never envisioned, and probably would have been alarmed by, a situation where electors would be bound to their state parties the way they are today.
Yeah.
The founders also assumed that the electors would rarely reach consensus on a clear winner, and the House of Representatives would end up picking the president most of the time, using the one vote per state delegation method that I described earlier. Most figured that after George Washington's unanimous election as our first president, all subsequent elections would feature lots of candidates splitting the electoral votes so that nobody got a majority. But that didn't happen either. National political parties formed almost immediately, and the number of candidates shrank. As a result, only 2 presidential elections were decided by the House, and the last one was nearly 200 years ago in 1824. So 33 states and the District of Columbia have laws on the books binding their electors to vote for the candidate to whom they pledge their vote. The electors are bound by honor and tradition, but just in case that doesn't work, states employ other methods, including oaths and fines. In other states, however, electors have been allowed to go rogue and vote for a different candidate. Though people have worried for years about the so-called faithless electors, it hasn't happened very often. According to the National Archives, over 99% of electors have voted for the candidate who won their state. That said, there were 7 faithless electors in 2016. 2 of them bolted Trump and 5 bolted Clinton. So, for extra credit, Mark, can you tell me who those faithless electors voted for?
I'm going to guess that the Clinton boltees, they probably bolted to Trump, and the Trump boltees bolted to Clinton, because I can't see any electors bolting to the Green Party candidate.
Well, that's wrong. Among Trump's electors split their votes between Colin Powell, John Kasich, and Ron Paul, while the 2 Clinton electors, one went for Bernie Sanders and one went for the Native American activist Faith Spotted Eagle.
Okay, so basically protest votes.
Yes.
Like, I know this is not going to make a difference, so I'm going to claim these 15 minutes of fame that history has offered to me in order to make a meaningless gesture.
That's right. But, in a very close election, that could be a pivotal gesture. And I want to get back to that because that's a very important part of the second half of my presentation. So put a pin in that for now. 5 times in our nation's history, a presidential candidate has won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. 5 times in nearly 250 years doesn't sound like a huge problem, but it's happened twice in the last 20 years, and both times the Democratic Party's candidate was victimized. Al Gore in 2000, and of course Hillary Clinton in 2016. Democrats have won the national popular vote in 4 of the last 5 presidential elections. That's 80% if you're keeping score. But they've only served as president for 8 of the last 20 years, which is 40%. If you ask me, that's a scandal, even before you factor in that the 2 Republicans who didn't win the popular vote, George W. Bush and Trump, are, by virtually all objective measurements, 2 of the worst presidents in the history of the country. And of course, I'm guessing that's the reason why you asked this question in the first place, and why you and many other Americans have begun questioning why the United States uses the Electoral College in the first place to pick its presidents.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Full disclosure, I live in Seattle, a city that votes Democratic every single time. I've always lived in major urban areas. I've never lived in the countryside. And so the Electoral College's slant towards sparsely populated, mostly rural states tends to disenfranchise me and people like me. So yes, we are asking these questions. And it seems in particular as the U.S.'s trend towards urbanization and density within those cities has accelerated over the last 50 years or so, that the disparity that many people like me have noticed between, the votes that are cast on the outcome at the national level, it seems like that's only going to get worse and worse until it becomes a real crisis in this country.
Yes, I think that's generally true, although I'm going to say a few things later that might make you rethink a little bit of that. So many people believe the Electoral College has long outlasted its usefulness. I suspect you're one of them. But the main reason why it still exists is because it was codified in the Constitution, and therefore it takes a constitutional amendment to modify or abolish it. And that's really hard to do. A constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 supermajority in Congress plus ratification by 3/4 of the states. That would be 38 states. In this hyper-partisan moment, good luck getting 2/3 of Congress to agree to anything more controversial than the naming of a post office. And anyone who remembers anything about the ongoing half-century plus fight for the Equal Rights Amendment knows how hard it is to get 38 states on board. And with one side of the aisle exclusively benefiting from the Electoral College's peculiarities for the past 2 decades, there's exactly zero incentive for a kumbaya moment around this issue, at least right now. But that doesn't mean politicians haven't tried. Since the passage of the 12th Amendment in 1804, at least 700 amendments have been offered to modify or abolish the Electoral College. The closest the abolitionists ever came was in the 91st Congress, which was during Richard Nixon's presidency. House Resolution 681 proposed a constitutional amendment for the direct election of the president and vice president, requiring a runoff if nobody received more than 40% of the vote. It passed the House in 1969 with a huge bipartisan majority, but it died in the Senate. A September 2020 Gallup poll found that 61% of Americans favor abolishing the Electoral College, and notably that's up 12 points from 2016. But you wanted to hear whether there are good reasons for keeping it around, so I'm going to offer you a few. The classic pro-Electoral College argument is that it prevents states with larger populations from having undue influence in the election of the president. Without the Electoral College, the situation we have now with candidates focusing on a few swing states would be reversed. Candidates would instead spend all their time getting out the vote in big cities and other heavily populated areas, while small states and rural areas would be marginalized or even ignored. Personally, I feel about that argument that may be so, but given the results of recent elections, one could counter-argue that the Electoral College has overcorrected for that problem and now gives undue influence to smaller and rural states, which is, I think, is what you were saying a minute ago.
Right. And if you think about it in terms of sort of the parallel scenario of the states that jockey to have their primary first, because that makes them more important, there's a tremendous focus right now in our political process on what the citizens of Iowa think, because they've managed to position their primary as the first one that's contested. And that defines the headlines coming out of that, and candidates get momentum, and candidates with momentum get donors and endorsements. And I think it's a fair question to ask, should Iowa have that much influence?
Yes.
What is it that makes Iowa that special that, for instance, a New York or an Illinois or a California, communities in that space do not deserve the same consideration?
And not just bigger states, I would argue also more diverse states, because you've got Iowa and then New Hampshire out of the gate, two of the whitest states in the nation, having this disproportionate effect. And I think that played itself out this year when Biden was basically left for dead until he got to South Carolina and black voters saved his hide,
Yeah, absolutely.
But that is the classic argument in favor of the Electoral College, but I want to give you a couple others. Electoral College supporters also argue that it provides a clear ending that eliminates the need for runoff elections or protracted recounts. Longtime columnist George Will points out that the Electoral College offers the country a way to cleanly and definitively adjudicate close elections, like the 1960 election in which JFK prevailed over Nixon by less than 120,000 votes out of nearly 69 million cast. Will wrote that if all those votes, quote, had been poured into a single national bucket, there would have been powerful incentives to challenge the results in many of the nation's 170,000 precincts. What do you think of that argument?
Well, first off, George Will, conservative columnist, of course, he's going to take a famous Democratic victory over Richard Nixon as his example.
Right.
But it's interesting in particular that he would select that as his example, because I was just reading an article about the fact that the Nixon campaign did, in fact, challenge the outcome of that campaign. They brought lawsuits in Illinois and California and other states attempting to invalidate the vote in those states and overturn the electoral majority. So it's not quite as cut and dried as he would suggest.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I just guessed that he picked that one because there was notorious cases of Texas and Illinois, with the Democratic machine in Illinois and Lyndon Johnson's machine in Texas may have cooked the books there and allowed JFK to win those two states when, in fact, Nixon may have been the actual winner.
Yeah, that's what the lawsuit specifically alleged. And
Right.
They did, in fact, get a recount in a number of those counties. And they found a level of questionable ballots that was way too small to overturn the election. So then they quietly withdrew their lawsuits rather than having it thrown out.
I see. The most charitable version of Will's argument is that you don't want to have the post-election landscape mired in lawsuit after lawsuit, recount after recount, or you might never get a president.
Right. Yeah.
And then here's another argument for the Electoral College. It offers a sheen of legitimacy to presidents who win with less than 50% of the popular vote. And this happens more often than you think. Of the 58 presidential elections since 1789, it has happened 19 times, which to me is a staggering figure. Most recently, of course, with Trump in 2016. And get this, Mark, Abraham Lincoln received only 39.7% of the vote in 1860, but he did win more than double the electoral votes of the second-place finisher. Nixon in 1968 and Bill Clinton in 1992 got only 43% pluralities because of strong third-party challenges, but both finished with electoral vote majorities. So what do you think of that argument for the sheen of legitimacy?
Yeah, it's a fair point. And I think there are some states who at the state level, if no candidate gets over 50%, they have the top two finishers go in a runoff a couple weeks later.
Yeah.
I feel that a president who's elected with, let's say 43% of the vote would be every bit as legitimate as a president who is elected with a 3 million vote deficit, like happened in 2016. And it seems like the government continues to function.
Yes.
The military continues to take that man's orders. It seems survivable to me.
Yeah. I think it's because norms have been so important in our country up until now. So the last thing on the pro ledger for the Electoral College that I want to say is just in terms of raw politics. Just because the Electoral College favors Republicans today doesn't mean that was true yesterday or will still be true tomorrow. In 2012, just 8 years ago, Barack Obama could have lost the popular vote by as much as 1.5% and still won the Electoral College. I didn't know that. And as certain red states in the Sun Belt like Arizona, Georgia, and Texas turn inexorably bluer, the math of the Electoral College may favor Democrats once again.
Yeah. I'm not so much tied to, Democrats winning. I feel like my emotional tie is that I'm more of an advocate of straight democracy, straight up democracy than representative democracy. I see the sense of electing congresspeople and senators who can go to Washington and spend, 2 or 4 years there and be somewhat independent from the will of the people back home where they're using their own judgment in terms of what they vote for. But when it comes to a president, I don't see the immediate need for an elector who stands between my vote and how that vote is cast.
Yes. And I would put it this way. Do we want our national elections affected by the vagaries of the Electoral College? A lot of people say no, and their critiques have reached critical mass in recent years. Former Obama speechwriter David Litt likened the Electoral College to the human appendix. This is the quote. Most of the time we don't notice it, and then every so often it flares up and nearly kills us. So here are the best arguments for an Electoral College appendectomy, if you will. First, its reason for existence is no longer relevant. The combination of political parties and modern technology allows even rural voters to get the information they need to make informed voting decisions. The Constitution was amended in a number of ways to allow for more direct democracy, with voting rights being given to blacks and then women, senators now elected by the people instead of by state legislatures as they were originally, and the vice presidency decided by voters instead of being awarded to the candidate who finished second in electoral votes, as happened at the beginning of the Republic. The second reason is the Electoral College leads to so-called swing states having disproportionate influence in deciding elections, as you just pointed out with Iowa and New Hampshire. Here's a revealing stat. In 2016, the Trump and Clinton campaigns made 94% of their stops in the 12 states where Trump was polling between 43% and 51%. Because both campaigns knew that was where the election would be won or lost. Thirdly, and I think this is the most compelling argument against the Electoral College, it's simply undemocratic, small d, democracy, and it discourages participation. It ignores the will of the people writ large. Why should fewer than 80,000 voters in a few swing states decide an election in which more than 130 million Americans voted and where the so-called loser received nearly 3 million more votes than the winner? That's just ass backwards. When you run an election like that, millions of people feel like their votes just don't matter. Is it any wonder why voter participation rates in the U.S. are so low compared to other countries?
Yeah, and other countries don't have any system like this, right? This is a uniquely American institution.
As far as I know, yes. So on balance, I'm with the people who think the Electoral College needs to go. I'm with you on this one. I'd like to believe I'd reach this conclusion even if my Democratic Party wasn't the one getting royally screwed by recent Electoral College results, because what's right is right, even if the benefit doesn't accrue to your side.
Yeah.
So a lot of our recent episodes of Mansplaining have been about dark topics that ended in grim woe is me fashion. So I want to end this episode on a brighter note. Thanks to a recent unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court, there might actually be a way to eliminate the noxious effect of the Electoral College while neither abolishing it nor needing a constitutional amendment. Remember those faithless electors I talked about earlier?
Yes.
I don't know if you heard about this with all the news breaking this summer, but in July, the Supreme Court ruled that states could force electors to honor the choice made by their state's voters, thus rendering faithlessness a relic of the past. That might not seem like a big deal on its face, but the court's rationale for why a state could bind its electors to the winner of that state's popular vote might also allow states to bind their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. And that would provide a constitutionally sound workaround for the Electoral College.
Yeah, I was reading about this. There's actually a campaign, isn't there, of states that they will vote to join this, but it doesn't go into effect until enough states have joined that it actually would determine, like it would be more than 270 votes.
Exactly. Let me tell you about this. Since 2006, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has sought to change the way we elect our presidents by essentially replacing our current system of 50 state elections with one truly national election. Participating state legislatures would pledge their state's electors to the winner of the national popular vote, regardless of the result in their particular state. And as you pointed out, this is the clever thing about it. It only goes into effect when enough states enact the bill so that a majority of 270 electoral votes are committed in that way. At present, 15 states and the District of Columbia, representing 196 electoral votes, have signed on to the compact. Getting to 270 won't be easy, but it's a hell of a lot easier than passing a constitutional amendment. The 15 states currently on board come in all sizes and many different regions of the country, but they're all blue states that have suffered under the minority rule of Bush and Trump.
Yeah.
Even so, I think there's cause for optimism, and here's why. The compact has already passed at least one legislative chamber in 9 additional states totaling 88 electoral votes, including Republican-led chambers in Arizona and Oklahoma. And as some formerly red states trend purple and blue and state legislatures are flipped, that number will only grow. As soon as it reaches 270, the Electoral College will essentially be relegated to the dustbin of history. I hope that makes you feel a little better, Mark.
A little bit better. Yeah, I will raise a glass to that in the event that enough states pass it and it goes through. Because returning back to something we touched on pretty early, that the Founding Fathers were very concerned with the tyranny of the majority, and we currently seem to be dealing with the tyranny of the minority. It seems like a constitutional upgrade would be some element of the government, in this case the executive branch, that is directly a function of the majority to offset minority interests that are entrenched in other parts of the government.
Right.
Checks and balances.
Essential part of our founding.
Way back when, somewhere, I think when I was a kid first studying U.S. history, either some history misled me or I got the wrong impression that electors were chosen because there was no way otherwise of reporting the votes. And so they would stuff the ballot results in their saddlebag and hop on their horse and ride to D.C. to report how Tennessee or Virginia or New Hampshire had voted. That doesn't seem to actually have been the case, but now I have a much better idea.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that idea, but the fact that there were no roads to speak of in places like Tennessee had a lot to do with why there was an electoral college, right. So that people could speak for what they thought of as the benighted masses who didn't know what the heck was going on in their country because they had no access to information.
It is funny just how many things that we deal with today were basically solutions to problems that people were experiencing in the late 18th century. And that world is so far different from ours. And yet here today, we continue to struggle with some compromises that they worked out because it was the only way for New York to agree with Virginia.
Yes, and I also think about the fidelity of some Supreme Court justices to the written word, the text of these 18th century documents, and how that's arguably steered us wrong over the years. But that's a topic for another podcast.
That would be a topic of another podcast. Speaking of which, do you have a question ready for me to investigate for the next one?
I do, and I'm really a little trepidatious and curious about how you're going to react to this question, because as I was finishing the Electoral College research, it was really important to me to end on a positive note, which is why I presented the Interstate Voter Compact at the end. And in that same vein, with the November 3rd election approaching and the, I would say, not insignificant chance of Armageddon looming over us, I want to switch gears and ask you about something that's not central to the fate of the Republic, but is interesting to me nonetheless. Okay?
Okay.
Movie theaters.
Oh.
Their demise has been predicted for decades, starting with the advent of television and then the availability of download technologies. And now coronavirus has shuttered movie theaters for months as top-drawer Hollywood blockbusters are either indefinitely postponed or released straight to streaming. And in just this past week, the country's second-largest movie chain shut down operations. So here's my question to you, Mark. Will movie theaters exist a generation from now?
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that. I will very much welcome the opportunity to think about something else other than what's going to happen on November 3rd between now and our next podcast. So I am looking forward to digging into this one.
Oh, good. I'm relieved to hear that.
Okay, so that's it for this week. And thank you, as always, to those of you who are tuning in to listen to our intellectual explorations. And we hope to see you again next time.
See you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.